Whereabouts are you, Way? May I ask?
I'm in London.
Oh, right, right.
Yeah.
You don't mind me asking, do you?
Nah, please
Oh.
ask me anything.
Yeah. So today's the last session in the clash of beliefs that we've been looking at over 8 or 9 weeks, and today we'll be looking at cultural U-turns, and we've all tried out all kinds of different backgrounds, but I think Tim is the winner for the weirdest the weirdest background.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how you're doing that, Tim.
No.
No,
Specialist.
neither am I. It's my aura.
Must be expanding, mustn't it? Must be expanding.
Yep.
So
Oh, that is back. It's going again.
yeah. So the last session today, we've done 8 or 9 weeks, and we'll be looking at the kinds of ways that society changes its mind. It sets out, this is how it is, and it creates its laws, and then 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 200 years later, it changes its mind, and we change the laws and we apologise to everybody, and that's what I've been looking at.
Sorry.
Cultural U-turns, and so the book, I think Martine's got the book as well, the cultural U-turns. I wanted to call it cultural U-turns, but the publishers wouldn't have it, so it's cultural perspectives on mental well-being, but it covers a lot of the stuff that we've been addressing. So hello Riddy, nice to see you. So I'll start as usual with the PowerPoint, and we'll see where you get to, and if you think I'm out of order, then do say so, do unmute yourself and comment, because often people say, well, that I'm wrong. So I hope everybody's got their tea. I've got mine, so I'm happy. So this is particularly looking at the clash of beliefs and things that happen over time, the changes that government make to their laws. And what I'm calling a cultural U-turn is when a government realises its laws, or in our case, in the last few weeks, its statutes, not only its statutes, but its statutes were made in error, and it criminalised its people, and it changes its mind. And so decades later, the laws are revoked about what is correct, and the government apologises for its earlier actions. And sometimes these apologies take centuries later. So the first few slides, I'll be looking at ways in which society has changed its mind. And then the last bit, I'll be looking at psychiatry and mental health and the things that have changed recently in mental health. So the first slide is the forced cultural U-turn that happened with the death in the United States by a police officer, but there had been many hundreds of deaths before that one, but that one had been recorded. And in Bristol, the people took down the statue of the slave owner and put it in the water. And I believe the government of Bristol have fished it out and put it in a museum of slavery. And this is a memorial to all the slaves that were thrown overboard. And it's an underwater sculpture. And so in the last month or so, we've seen that civic monuments have fallen down, or they were drowned, or they were taken down quietly by local governments. And there was a polarization between a human, a man. Was it a good person? Was it a slave trader, or was it a benefactor for people's? They seem to have done a lot of good, but based on the slave trade. So that won't wash anymore. And my feeling is we've seen these statues coming down, but what we really need now is to decolonize the curriculum around history, around what's going on in the schools. And National Geographic magazine was good in 2018. It acknowledged for the first time that it had been racist in its own articles. So they wrote, for decades our coverage was racist. To rise above our past, we must acknowledge it. And I'm just wondering if anybody else has experienced subtle racism. Has anybody experienced here subtle racism, whether by language or skin color or religion or migration? Would anybody like to comment?
Well, when you say subtle, I've had one or two direct experiences that weren't subtle. But you were asking particularly for subtle ones, were you?
Well, subtle and unsubtle. Can you tell us in a couple of sentences, and then I'll ask Krishna to talk?
Okay.
Yeah, yes, it was one of my colleagues at work, a colleague engineer. In fact, out of all the engineers I worked with, he was one person I particularly liked the company of. One day, very unusually, my wife phoned the office. Of course, there were lots of desks, and he answered it. Well, she was Persian with an accent. And he said, here you are, here's the phone. I didn't know your wife was a Paki. And what really made me very, very sorrowful was the fact that he was generally such a nice person, but that subtle racism was there. In fact, she doesn't come from Pakistan, she was Persian, but that doesn't really matter.
Yeah, so wrong kind of accent, because we did, with the Brexit, we were having Polish men murdered for speaking Polish in Britain, weren't we? We had curious things happen. Krishna, did you want to say anything?
Well, where do I start? It's having arrived here as a 14-year-old. It's interesting, from Kenya, which was a British colony. It's interesting what you said, the curriculum needs changing, and I wholeheartedly have always advocated that, because on arrival, people didn't know where Kenya was, despite the fact that it was one of the colonies. And so you can imagine, as a young teenager, totally bemused to come to a monocultural society, which it was then. I'm talking about late 60s, 70s, and to fit in. I've always said that our imperial history, I call it our history now, has to be, taught to all of us. And I think that might be a starting point for this country anyway. Because every so often, all the time. Even last week, some people who have been on a Zoom group for quite a long time asked me, what made you come here, or what? And there is just total blindness of the British imperial history, which sadly has not been taught as far as I know, unless you go to university level or otherwise you choose to learn it yourself. I mean, that word you use, Peter, I was called that word when I'd only been here about 2 weeks, and by a child, possibly, if I remember correctly, walking by the mum with another baby in a pushchair. And I, at that time, because I've been here such a short time, I didn't know what it meant. So I turned around and said, oh, I am not from, I'm Kenyan. When they use, you can see I'm hesitant to use the word even.
Yeah.
It was so painful because I came from Mombasa, which was a very multicultural seaport in Kenya, and I was used to mixing with a very diverse community. It's been tough going in jobs, in promotion, in any education. Straight away, I mean, my experience was, and which some other migrants who came at that time might say, I was straight away put into a class of immigrant school, it was called, despite the fact that I had been to an English-speaking school in Kenya. And I was put in, and I felt totally neglected from that point even, was put in a porter cabin, and then 2 weeks later taken to a proper school as a 14-year-old. And then again, to make it worse, put in a class where everybody was leaving school in 6 months' time. So just written off before I had even started. And
So you've had numerous experiences.
Numerous basically.
Experiences.
And in every, I mean, I'm painting a terrible picture because despite that, I have gone and achieved, I think, quite a lot in this society, because I've sort of taken it as a challenge and said, no, like I did my degree in my late 30s, early 40s, because I just wanted to prove to the system that I'm okay. And I did. Natalie knows. I'm sort of, and I'm also a qualified nurse, so there's stories all along the way.
Yes, thank you, Krishna. And in the chat, we've also got Metal Rabbit has been putting comments of her experiences as well, if anybody would like to look. So there's racism, reverse racism, there's subtle racism, there's being nice and being racist. So there's all kinds of ways that we're looking at now. And I'm interested in this, the clash of beliefs, and who might experience a clash of beliefs with regard to different ways of thinking. And the 4 groups I've put up here, and there may be many more, are populations that have been colonized. There's people who are new migrants and refugees. There's people who think alternatively about health. There's ways of excluding people who think differently, particularly on Facebook. If you use the word homeopathy, you get a lot of mentions for 3 weeks about misinformation. And then there's conflicting scientists who believe different things. And the issues are, there's this assumption of superiority, whether it's based on religion or skin color, or a different or better morality or behavior. There's clashes of beliefs about common consensus. and how we interpret experiences. There's concerns about the causes of sickness and even the nature of reality itself. So there's many groups of people who can have clash of beliefs over health. And the problem is, when we've just got one interpretation of human experiences, that there appears to be a hierarchy of knowledge. And the dilemma is Western opinions have dominated cultural wisdoms, and it's a particular issue for those who've had mental distress. And the old assumption is that biomedical models of mental health are universal, and they're not. And I'll illustrate that later on with many psychiatrists who've shifted opinion. So I've just got a few examples of cultural U-turns over time, and the assumption around being gay, that it was a mental sickness. So some societies changed their mind over homosexuality, but not all of them. And then there was the example, I've just given a couple of short examples of each thing, where Dr. Alan Turing, he played a key role in breaking the Enigma code in World War II, but he was convicted for gross misconduct, gross indecency in 1952, and then he committed suicide in 1954. And in 1967, offences were decriminalised, but people still had a criminal report on their record. And in 2013, he was granted a royal pardon. And but other less famous men who happened to be gay were saying, no, we came into this world without a criminal record and we want to leave without one. So they're questioning it. I've just got a snapshot of a few things. There's the stolen generation in Canada and USA, where people tried to assimilate the local populations to make them more European, more American. And this carried on from 1790 until the early 20th century. Children were taken by force from their parents and forced to reside in distant schools. And there's still people in their 50s in the USA who were taken away from their families and educated as white. In Australia, it's the same thing. We, whoever we are, we had this opinion that we knew better, and the Aboriginal children were stolen and sent away from their families to school. They're known as the stolen generation because the government didn't believe in them. They thought they'd be better fostered with white parents. So in the name of humanity, we've done really curious things. The next snapshot is looking at unmarried mothers and forced adoption, because sex outside of marriage was a mental illness, was mental deviance. And so tens of thousands of babies, mostly for teenage mothers, were taken and given to married couples, and people felt they were signing away their children. But in 2013, the Australian Prime Minister issued an apology to people affected by the forced adoption policy. 1950s and 1970s, that's in my lifetime. And she said, by saying sorry, we can correct the historical record. We can declare that these mothers did nothing wrong, that you always loved your children and always will. And women report being forced to stay in maternity homes, sometimes being tied to a bed and watching as their child was taken away. I've just put one example in from the UK. This was by Phil Frampton, who was of multiple heritage. He did the book The Golly in the Cupboard, and he visited the home where his mother gave birth to him in 1953. She bore me in secret to avoid bringing shame. Mothers were systematically humiliated and forced to watch from a locked room as adoptive parents drove away their babies. And these institutions were publicly funded through the Church of England and local authority. And at that time, mixed race parentage, a person who had multiple heritage was considered a physical defect. So does anybody have an example of someone who was discriminated against? Does anyone have an example of someone who was discriminated against?
Just one comment, Natalie. The word when I was younger, the word half caste was used. Fortunately, we never hear it now, but that was the word, wasn't it? Half caste.
Yeah, and even mixed race, whereas really it's dual heritage.
Your heritage, yeah.
Does anyone else have an example of discrimination because of the way they look? If not, I shall carry on. But Wei, would you like to say what you've said in the chat? If you unmute yourself.
What I said in the chat. Yeah, it's just what's happening in the Western countries now is quite interesting. It just reminds me, you know, along Chinese history, we went through periods like this from 2000 years ago until during Cultural Revolution, which is Mao time in 1960s. So I was born in 1968. So I was born during the Cultural Revolution. I was a baby, I couldn't remember anything, but from literature you read, drama you watch, it was a bit like now in the West, that you have to be very careful with what you're saying. You know, you almost have to say, long life Chairman Mao, before anything you want to say. So yeah, we call that, it's like a word in prison. So now it's a bit like that. You know, it's ridiculous that you have to be so careful with what you say. But actually, I find it's a bit like a lip service. You know, you say certain things, but do you really, really care? So this political correction, it's a bit really on the surface. We're not really solving the problem. You know, there's a reason why there is the racism. Why is that? Nobody asked that question.
Yeah, thank you, Wei. I find it curious that.
So, yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It's a bit dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how we,
it can be, you know, really dangerous. You know. What do you want to say, Natalie?
No, I was saying it's curious how, as human beings, we can know who we are only in opposition. Our identity is in opposition to other people.
Yeah, I don't the term dual identity. I don't think that describes anybody, because most of us have got a lot more than just two heritages in our background.
Yes, that's right.
It's not just one.
Yeah, this idea of purity.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I know some people are very sensitive about their background. I know somebody whose parents were both Polish, but he was born in England and he's always lived in the same house. And when somebody asks him if he's English, he's very dodgy about mentioning about his background usually. You know, he'll say, I'm a citizen of the world, because he doesn't feel it's anybody's business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
And Metal Rabbit, thank you, Diane, has made the point that it would be nice to be seen not in opposition to anybody racially, not to have that as an issue. Sophie, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just talk about a bit about my experience, because obviously my mother is Mexican and my father's English, and I moved from Mexico to Lincolnshire, which is one of the most rural counties in this country, when I was 8, so that was very difficult, and I was subjected to a lot of racism while I lived there. I think it's one of the reasons I applied to Bristol, because I think it was more to come to university, because I thought it would be kind of a more diverse city and place. But I don't know, I guess sometimes I look for kind of like reverse racism, and I know that a few months ago I was in a meeting where people were talking about like intergenerational trauma. So, you know, obviously there is a lot of intergenerational trauma in my Mexican family, but the person that was talking about it assumed that it was only my Mexican side that was traumatized or had intergenerational trauma. So I found that, and I guess they were trying to be kind and kind of go on about, you know, the trauma in you know, these, I guess, colonized or subjected countries, because obviously Mexico was colonized by Spain. But, you know, actually, despite my my father, who's English, being, I guess, upper middle class, he comes from a family who have had generations of people go to public school. I actually find him much more traumatized and out of touch with his humanity and feelings than my mum. So it's interesting how different nations are traumatized, or classes as well.
Yes, thank you. And there's this issue of historical trauma in our ancestral line, but there's also other people can experience spiritist trauma, where people can pick up trauma of things that have happened before and that may be nothing to do with their ancestral line. So the issue of whose trauma is very complex. And I obviously mentioned earlier when we looked at this that I had memories of the Holocaust where I wasn't there and none of my ancestral family was there. And then I developed this proposition that people could pick up anything from anywhere, not only their direct ancestral line. So it's a very complex issue, Gabrielle, did you want to make a comment about what you've been putting in the chat?
Hi, Natalie. No, at first I mentioned that what Wei was talking about with the Cultural Revolution was interesting. And then my second comment was about some work that I've been exploring recently, and also like a decade ago or so. Maybe you've heard of Ken Wilber's integral theory. Maybe some people here have. And so there's kind of this exploration of different domains of understanding reality, and also mapping psychological stages of development and also civilizational stages of development. I found integral theory to be extremely helpful for me in navigating cultural memes, thoughts, evolution of society, psychology over the years. And that work is being explored anew now in the recent years with the work of meta-modernism by Hansi Freinacht, which if you just look that up, you can find his website, and there's some podcasts he's been featured in. It's very illuminating to understand what modernism views as important, what postmodernism views as important, and its egalitarian values, and then how to actually integrate and transcend those, but include their insights without rejecting them in something that's like more developed, a synthesis, maybe more mature even. So I just wanted to recommend that, because we are touching on some of these topics with with racism and even spirituality. So I think it's been helpful for me, so I wanted to recommend it.
Thank you. So it's in the chat box if people would like to look. I think. Thank you, Gabrielle. When this is finished, I may look at the material in the chat box and then send it round so that everybody has access to the insights, because there's people here who've got different kinds of expertise, and it would be good to take advantage of that. I'm just carrying on with the issues that occurred in Canada. I've got a couple of slides about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where 1982, they recognised the existing Aboriginal rights of the original people of Canada, and this redefining of the people. And one component of it was the Indian residential schools, where people who were not, excuse my language, white European, who were from the indigenous populations, were taken into schools and resettled. And the commission, it documents the truth of survivors and the communities of people who were affected by these Indian residential schools, where children were taken from the parents, and so causing a trauma because they felt maybe the original peoples couldn't feel trauma because they weren't, excuse my language, white or Christian. So in 2008, Canada apologised for the residential school system. So progress has been made on paper and in reports, but if you look at social media, you can still see the effects of police behaviour in different cultures. So I don't think it's done and dusted just because there's a huge Truth and Reconciliation report available. So I'm going to change topic now and look at cultural U-turns in the way mental distress is treated. And I've given examples earlier of forced adoption and forced schooling, and the way Africans, Canadians, Australians and First Nation Americans were treated. and unmarried parents, it was assumed that the parents were mentally deficient if they had sex outside of marriage, and the babies themselves were mentally ill. We did look at that in earlier sections. So sex outside of marriage was mental deviancy, homosexuality was a criminal effect. So those were historical cultural U-turns that have occurred. And I want to look at mental health to see what's going on. And the confusion for me comes because there's one human race and the world's made up of different people. But for some reason, it seems that we've made a living by othering other people, by making war or expanding difference. And the point that I wanted to make here is that the Western understanding of human experience isn't universal, and particularly people who have experiences of distress that can be interpreted as mental health pathology, or they can have supernatural experiences or spiritual awakening. So there are different narratives around that. And I'm wondering if we need a mental health truth and reconciliation project in the same way that Canada had one. But we need not only to have a paper research exercise, but also create change in practice. So today, people want their altered states of consciousness, their extreme experiences to be considered with compassion, however we choose to interpret them. And I've shown this slide before, but I like it. Looking at global mental health, there are two meanings of it. And one is the export of the biomedical diagnosis and treatment models to promote agreed symptoms and agreed pharmaceutical treatment. And the two books which show the other is Decolonizing Global Mental Health by China Mills and Crazy Like Us by Ethan Watters. The second meaning is where we export our understanding of cultural models of diagnosis and treatment to promote collaboration about interpretation and the meaning of illness. And global mental health is the same term used for each of those quite different meanings. And what I've realized, maybe all of us have realized, that there's come a turning point, and there's so much evidence now about the old way of thinking about mental health. And it seems it's not just academic, but it hasn't reached all of the frontline service providers. So people do want change within psychiatry. They want the context of experience acknowledged, that is the history, the trauma, whatever. They want poverty and institutional racism addressed. And they want where some people are considered to have spiritual awakening. And I don't often get to put an elephant in my presentations, but it is this elephant in the room that we're not looking at. And here's another one. So there's been a challenge. So this whole thing of chemical imbalance in diseases of the brain, there's scientific challenge to that. And there's so much literature available and suggestive of a need for profound change in practice.
No.
So we don't just need the academic, we need frontline practitioners. And I'm just wondering, has anybody here had experience of turning points with regard to mental health? Has anybody had experience of turning points of change?
Yeah. Hi, Natalie. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah, I have. I'm not sure though if you. I feel like I've experienced quite a lot, so I'm not sure if you want to be more specific or you're just asking in general.
I was just asking in general because I go on to be specific in the next slide. Should I carry on, or do you want to give an example?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Just like on a personal level, just real, I guess, as briefly as I can. I think a lot of people have different ancestral forms of mental illness. They find out later, and so on both sides of my family, I have a bit of this, a bit of that, and I feel that when I was in my 20s, I started exploring cannabis and psychedelics and things like that, and also meditating. But I felt that, due to my own predispositions, maybe genetically, that there was that the use of some substances was not necessarily in my best interest, and I have felt myself go into depression, into maybe even I could extrapolate something and say, oh, if I keep going with this, I might actually experience psychosis or something. So I kind of saw the dangers of that, and I just started to shift my approach to more endogenous means of spirituality. And I kind of I was a neuroscience. I went into neuroscience because I wanted to study psychedelics, basically. And then I shifted into more endogenous states and meditation. And it's interesting now to see there's kind of a psychedelic renaissance of sorts happening now. And I sort of tried to do that when it was taboo, so I moved on to something else. But I think that for me, I've been through depression. I was able to lift myself out of that. I would even say at different points in my life, I've had like very subclinical versions of what I would characterize as bipolar emotionality. But I think I've been very aware of all those things and done my best to manage it through spirituality, analytical meditation, self-work, energy work, psychotherapy. So that's kind of the most condensed version of it I can give, I think.
Okay, thank you, Gabrielle. Hopefully we'll hear more about that research. Paul, you made a comment in the chat. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, I think my meaning is probably fairly clear, but I can expand upon it. And in fact, there has been a development upon the lines I suggest this week. One of my colleagues, who is himself a psychiatrist specializing in children's mental health, as one of over 100 psychiatrists who wrote to the Royal College, calling them out basically on what they considered to be their institutionally racist practices and their role in societal oppression of non-white people, which is a historical fact and continues to result in an overrepresentation of Black people in the psychiatric system, an over representation of Black people who are diagnosed with a variety of different supposed disorders, but the main labels associated with that type of diagnostic practice are schizophrenia and psychosis. So there are really troubling practices that need to come to the fore. And I think the legitimacy of this particular school of psychiatry, the diagnose and medicate school of psychiatry, is being questioned constantly, and its authority, its power is being steadily chipped away. And we will reach a point where the profession will be forced to recognize the power and legitimacy of the people who are criticizing it and move in a different direction.
Thank you. Yes, the examples I give in the next few slides are of psychiatrists who are aware that their training doesn't fit to the current perspective.
My friends, part of the purpose of my friend's letter was not simply to point out, adverse psychiatric practice, but also to suggest a complete and radical change in the way psychiatrists are educated to take account of these powerfully important cultural perspectives.
Yes, that's what I'd like to see. That's
It will happen.
really what I'd like to see, training towards that. And as you suggested, a truth and reconciliation with regard to mental health. I did try and contact people in Geneva because I thought these things needed to be discussed at United Nations, but so far I haven't had any joy getting things happening. So I've got examples of a handful of psychiatrists who do want to examine racism in mental health. I've got one here is Suman Fernando, now in his 80s, a Londoner, and he's done books on institutional racism in psychiatry and a lot of books on mental health and institutional health. And he explores how the system has shifted in response to new kinds of racism. And his books do make a compelling case for institutional racism, with a call for a paradigm shift, both in theory and in practice. Because what I'd like to see, there is the written stuff, there is the academic stuff, and we need it taught to frontline practitioners so that we change how people are treated when they suffer. I've got an African example of a South African psychiatrist, I think who was also Irish, Stan Papenfuss, and he's written a book, Renewing Our Lives, a radical alternative to psychiatric colonialism. And he compared the domination, what's that on my screen? He compared the domination of patients to the racial control of people under apartheid. And he wanted to find ways of dismantling apartheid, not only in South Africa, but the apartheid between patients and staff in psychiatric hospitals. I've written a review of his book for Scientific and Medical Network. I missed the deadline by half an hour, so it should come out in 2 or 3 months' time. But he suggested, in order to overthrow psychiatric colonization, we need to acknowledge the fraudulence, the manipulation of the scientific method and false reporting. So that what makes me feel optimistic is that there are psychiatrists now that are standing up. There's one, the Dutch psychiatrist, Jim van Os, suggests that the term schizophrenia should be abolished. There's one, Sir Robin Murray, he claims that the terms will be confined to history, and there's an acknowledgement that there are many different causes for symptoms, and childhood trauma is one. And again, in the Department of Psychiatry in Dublin, the concept of schizophrenia is coming to an end, Simon McCarthy-Jones. So it is the psychiatrists themselves who've had enough. And it's also the scientific evidence that's coming into question. The anthropologist James Davies shows how psychiatry put money and medical status above patients' well-being. He showed the evidence of negative drug trials where the results were hidden, where antidepressants were the same as placebos, and research was manipulated to produce positive results. Excuse me. So doctors created disorders in order to give pills. So he said there was ethical, scientific and treatment flaws concealing the mass marketing. And his book, Cracked, Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good, it reveals for the first time the true human cost of an industry that in the name of helping others has actually been helping itself. And also Robert Whittaker, who did a couple of books, Anatomy of an Epidemic and Psychiatry Under the Influence. And he asks, why has the number of disabled mentally ill people in the United States tripled over the last 2 decades? And the second book explores how the influence of pharmaceutical money corrupted the American Psychiatric Association for the past 35 years. So these people have written the evidence. What I want to see is a change in frontline education, not just in the books, but I want to see people, staff are trained differently. And I'm just giving a handful of examples here, but there's many more. This one's the psychiatrist Joanna Moncrief, who questions the drugs and questions the assumption of brain disease. And she suggests that the drugs themselves create a state of suppression. So she says their toxic effects outweigh any advantages, and she's done the book, The Bitterest Pills. Another one is the physician Peter Gotche, who exposes the fraudulent behaviour of research and marketing, and he addresses system failure caused by crime, corruption, bribery. And the reason we take so many drugs is companies sell lies. And this is his book. So there's plenty of research evidence and what from practitioners, and what I want to see is this change in how staff are being taught. So not just to have lovely research books on the side and students are still being taught old psychiatry and old psychology. So that there is change. There's Drop the Disorder, which is a Facebook group for anyone wanting to challenge biomedical approaches. And they want a different language from disorder and diagnosis and drugs. And they run conferences throughout the UK. There's Open Dialogue. Started with the Nelft NHS Foundation Trust that organises conferences that are widely attended by healthcare staff on different ways of working with patients or people. And they've set up Dialogue First service, which can be, anyone can be referred to it by their GP. It's in North East London Foundation Trust. In California, there's the work of Michael Cornwall on the Gnosis Retreat Center, a safe space for people who are in crisis and for others to support them. So it's like a refuge. And there are places here, we heard earlier about the Matri. Would anybody else like to share with us the safe spaces that they have in their area? What kind of safe spaces do people know about? I know is it Islington or Finsbury Park, the Matri? No. So there are examples. Karen Taylor and Ron Coleman have got one in Scotland, and yeah, Georgie is just saying the Maytree's in Finsbury Park, and it has small number of staff and rooms for people to be supported. So change is happening. I just want to see it happen faster. So we've got Emerging Proud by Katie Mottram. We've got The Mad in America with Michael Cornwall. We've got Joe and his work he's doing with Radical Culture, inviting people to talk. Again, he's based in Brighton. And the film Crazy Wise, which is looking at health differently. So my issue is this problem of polarization of human beings, where there's this conflict. Psychiatrists do that, medical doctors do this, shamans do the other, psychologists do that. There's spiritual awakening, spiritual emergence. Spiritists do this, chaplains do the other. And so there's different little empires with supporting people, but how do we universally ensure people with experience of distress are supported with the best possible care and counselling? Is there any way that we can ensure that people are supported better? Spiritual Crisis Network, thank you, Georgie. And
I feel like I want to say training and education and understanding around it. Yeah, just repeating what you're saying, but yeah, I think it needs to happen quicker, basically. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like we've done the research. Don't tell me we need more research. Let's just take action based on the points. So Margaret Rose, would you like to say anything about in your area? If you unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, I haven't found anything in my area. I live in Florida, and I was really searching hard for places. A few years ago, I was going to go visit this place in Vermont. It's fascinating. It's a woman that was trained, an American, but she was trained in the Waldorf system of education, and she worked in England many years. And when she came back to the U.S., she was astounded that there was nothing for the kind of thing that you're saying, a retreat that weans people away from medication. It's fascinating and beautiful, but unfortunately it's expensive. And I really haven't found anything now. That's why I think that what you're saying about education is key, because a woman from Shades of Awakening, Christina Moore, she's just starting up her studies in psychology. So what was really, really important is for programs like yours to go into for psychology, these places that study psychology have to really revamp everything they're teaching, because they're teaching, and psychiatry, it's horrific for them to keep teaching that to people who want to help, and they end up learning all this chemical bullshit. You know, it's horribly, horribly damaging. Fortunately, my brush with it was pretty short term, but very short term in comparison to a lot of people, because I had already worked within the system, and so I shook it off. But it's horribly, it's a crime against humanity, really. So there is a group called Speak Out Against Psychiatry, but it's like you say, we keep speaking out. But now, fortunately, with Katie and the stigma has been, and Paul Levy, and the stigma is gone, and we're ready to speak. But we have to go. Like if your program could be implemented in every single place where people are studying, like you say, the research is done. We're the research. We were the guinea pigs, swallowing all this garbage and poison. The worst time in my life is when I was taking the poison. Fortunately, I dumped it out and took homeopathic pills instead. But I haven't found a place. I think of, in Guatemala, there's a place that's doing something like this for the people there, because people who are going through these kind of things in a country like Guatemala, they'd search for places in the US and end up sending their family members to, well, I'm kind of tired right now. I can't think of a better word than bullshit places. So, but Guatemala has a small place so that people won't have to search for places that are far away. They're away from their families, and they end up being tricked, really. I was tricked by a psychiatric nurse practitioner because I was tired of practitioners, psychiatrists, chemical dispensers. So I was tricked. Psychiatric nurse practitioner. Her whole web page, mindfulness, and mindfulness here, and meditation there. Her whole page was about it. But she was also taking what they call a consumer. She was under psychiatric care, taking medicines. So I had an hour of care instead of 10 minutes. But in the end, it was nothing mindfulness at all. I ended up taking 5 medications. One to not go too down, one to go too up, one equalizer, one for 5. So of course I shook that off. But yeah, more and more people, but they're coming along, because the stigma with Katie and your work and everybody's, the stigma is coming along in a way that, well, I keep working in art therapy. I've been working in that as an alternative to psychiatry for my whole adult life. I met David Cooper years ago in Trieste it was called Primo Incontro Internazionale di Alternativi Psichiatrici. And it was 35, 37, 40 years ago, with Franco and Franca Basaglia in Trieste. It was on the grounds of an emptied out psychiatric institution. And it was fascinating, but it just has to keep, well, anyway, we're going through a big shift. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad you're part of it.
Thank you, Margaret.
But it is happening. It is happening because people are ready to bust out of these groups. They're not small. Speak Out Against Psychiatry is not small. But
that's right. The change is happening.
Yeah, they want to come.
Thank you, Margaret, for those examples. Can I say, Riddhi put her hand up. Do you still want to talk, Riddhi?
Yes, hi there, Natalie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I just wanted to speak to the slide that you put up about the problems with polarization. And yeah, just like you pointed out, there's obviously lots of different professional groups. I'm a clinical psychologist myself, and I can understand the infighting and the different sort of dogmas that different disciplines and points of view kind of elicit. But I think the question that you posed about how healthcare can work with this, I think it's really acknowledging that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, whether it's psychiatry, psychology, spirituality, all of these perspectives have their place. And I think it's much more about meeting the individual where they are and as they are, with whatever approach is best for them in that moment or stage of life for them. Yeah, I just wanted to add that, because I think we can then move into a position of, coming from the perspective that psychology or therapy is the best thing for everything, or spirituality is the best thing. And then I think it's the same thing, but just with a different approach. So I think it's just important to recognize that healthcare training and education as it is now, unfortunately, tries to put people into boxes and reduces everything to kind of simple tick box or formulas or the standardized approach. But unfortunately, that's not what human beings are about. We're all complex. We have lots of parts to us, and I think it's just important, like you say, as practitioners, just to acknowledge that we're trying to meet people where they are, and as they come to us with all of their flaws and strengths and everything that they're about.
Thank you, Riddy. Yes, and it is. I think it is for all of us to work together with all the different practitioners, including psychics, clairvoyants, shamans, and the like, to create a lasting educational change. Gabrielle, you wanted to say something, and then Emily, yes? Okay.
Yeah, so I like the comments I've been hearing about education and treating the individual human and approaching what their needs are. So I think I shared a little bit briefly about myself in the past lesson a few weeks ago. So I'm a neuroscientist and a body-mind educator, and I'm a musician as well. And so for me, I've kind of seen things from the laboratory point of view, the academic. I've seen the pluses and minuses, the kind of negative aspects of academia, I would say, and conventional medicine. And I wanted to be a doctor many years ago, and it didn't go that way. And I've been through, various sort of critical phase transitions in my psychology, and energetic psychology as well. And I think that one thing that's important is for education for each individual to learn how to sense make, sense of what they hear, and how to see and feel the interdependent aggregate nature of everything that they encounter, so they can tease apart someone's intention from someone's skill, from someone's own traumas. So let's say they go to the local Reiki healer. That local healer is going to have their own humanness and their own baggage and their own stuff. And always, I think it's important for every individual to always ask, what is the core technique? What is the core skill that the person that's in front of me right now, whoever it is, whether it's a psychiatrist, the healer, the social worker, the so on and so forth, what is the core skill that they know through their life experience? And how do I separate their any emotional baggage that they have from that, so that I can learn that? So I feel like to develop that ability to ask that question, someone needs to have either been educated in how to sense make, and from different perspectives, like in a sort of integrated or integral education course or curriculum, and or having gone through those things themselves. In my case, I've been through enough things where I'm like, these things don't make sense together, at least initially. So under what meta perspective or meta framework would they make sense? And then asking that question and opening that intention to cultivate that meta network of how things relate to each other just opens up the kind of cultivates that meta perspective in and of itself, even if at first I didn't know how to do it. I would say also that integrative spiritual, psycho-spiritual, and bodily approaches that all work together. I've had success with that kind of angle, rather than going into one rabbit hole infinitely and then kind of coming out and realize, oh, I wasted 3 years doing mindfulness meditation and it didn't get me anywhere really. So something that has worked for me quite a lot is something called Dr. Glenn Morris's method, or Kundalini awakening process. It's not Kundalini yoga, as that's a whole nother thing that I would argue is not even Kundalini. That's more of a marketing term.
Yeah, I think there is Joe Bartholomew, who's not here today, but he's looking into multiple cultural ways of exploring experience. And then there's open dialogue in the UK, where they are listening more carefully to people and their experience. So
I think so. You know, I think that's important, and I think that from the approaches that I've done that are more integrative, it's kind of like there's this check and balance system in for example, the last one I mentioned, CAP, or Kundalini Awakening Process, where if you want to go more into the void and you want to go more into your psychical abilities and you want to travel and you want to go do things in other realms, the more you do that, the more you have to lift weights, basically, because what happens is that then you become less functional in your everyday life, less embodied, because your consciousness is basically somewhere else, or at least it's being siphoned off somewhere else. So you need to actually counterbalance every single thing you do. And the more integrated you become, the more challenge that becomes. But over time, there is a greater simplicity that is cultivated. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think that having meta frameworks is crucial to help one stay on track and remain in balance, and to have not just an awakening and then, you know, you go off into one path, but have an integration. And this is going to become more of an issue now with people going into psychedelics, you know, more and more and more, and they're going to have these awakenings and not know how to integrate them. So
yeah, I think now
there.
There's things like the hidden specialists, like the psychics, the clairvoyants, the shamans, the psychopomps. They've always been able to shift into other states of consciousness and come back. And I think the issue with so many other people now, they seem to be shifting consciousness without being aware, and they're not integrating it, as you're saying, Gabrielle. So people are uncertain. Thank you, Gabrielle. Emily, would you like to make your comment?
Well, yes, I think what I really feel at the moment is, you know, so much of us, so many of us are really passionate about wanting to create enough momentum that the theoretical underpinning concerning psychiatry is kind of augmented to include, as you say, you know, the research on all of us as guinea pigs that's just being brushed aside. And you know, I've absolutely loved this series of talks, and you know, I think this is a really well-informed group of people, and I guess what I'm looking for right now is a kind of supportive structure of people who have the same vision for change, who maybe kind of want to create some sort of supportive structure where all of our actions can kind of act in concert towards our shared vision. So I'm just wondering whether an organisation like that exists.
Yeah, I'd like to see it without empire building.
Yeah,
because I think we've done empire building, and I think there must be some way of setting up an organisation that takes all the aspects, the neuroscience, the diet, the Kundalini experiences, the art, but does it without building an empire and another civilization, and creates opposition with other people. And I don't know how. I mean, I'm not a business person, but I was saying to Joe Bartholomew this morning, just can we find someone who doesn't want the ego of a business, but wants to set something up for human well-being without being in opposition?
yeah. I mean, it's something that I'm looking at exploring setting up for myself, but I guess you know, the challenges associated with that is because I've been on the receiving end of so much of this. That's, maybe undermined my faith in myself to a point where, you know, I feel like every time I try to initiate something, as soon as I receive a pushback, I then retreat into myself. And so yeah, that's something for me to think about, but it's good to know that there is kind of theoretical support for that.
Yeah, I want more than theoretical support. I used to be a researcher, and I made a vow in 2010 never to do research again, because people just needed the research report and they never took action on the recommendations. So I made a vow in 2010 not to do research anymore. So, but yeah, maybe now there's enough of us, and our experience is varied enough, and we've had experiences of the system, so that we can be the change.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's what I'm hoping. I am aware of the time, and I'm aware that this is the last session. So I'm thinking maybe to set up discussion groups where people can present what they're doing in slightly more detail, and then have a discussion around that, which I may do. I'm assuming I've got everybody's email address. Did you all come through email? So I can contact you, because I think it would be good to hear in more detail exactly those people that are setting up places, because I'm impatient. I want to see change in the education system. I don't just want to see the research reports and the lovely textbooks, but that's what I want. Would anybody like to just make a comment about leaving and say thank you to everybody for everybody's input? Really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Natalie, and to everyone here. It's really been a pleasure to go through this little mini series of discussions and interacting with everyone in an organized and pleasant way. You know, if there's a discussion group that forms up after this, I'd be keen to explore that. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, did you want to say something?
Yes, I showed up like 20 minutes ago. I got the time zones all wrong. I'm sorry. But I just wanted to say hi, and I got like a gist of the end of the conversation, and so I wanted to add in something that I think is important. That's a barrier to entry in terms of getting the sort of help that people need. Is that, and I'm speaking for myself at one point as well. People tend to have a victim mentality with respect to the system. And I think that we have the choice to make use of it or not. And like, I think it's important to educate people that there are other options out there, and that there are people who have experienced the other options and have been successful in making use of them.
Yeah, yes, and I want them systematized so they're normal. So, and this thing of why we only feel our identity in opposition to others, and I'd like that opposition to stop. So I'd like us to look at things from Indigenous communities and have a greater awareness of subtle states of consciousness and altered states. And I just want educators to address this treatment, this teaching about other ways of understanding things. So that's what I would like to see. I would like to see fundamental change. Sophie, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I want to make a really quick point, which is, you know, my experience of my open dialogue training in the last 2 years, where there is, you know, 9 psychiatrists and about 10 psychologists, and, you know, how difficult it has been for them, because it is like an existential journey to kind of transform from, you know, someone that does things like, you know, diagnosis and does things to someone who is now, you know, in dialogue and present in a room, human being and not an expert. And how, you know, I'm kind of like taking my hat off to the trainers for, I guess, the patience in responding, but also bring it, you know, it's so important to also bring these people along so that, you know, this is where this oppositional, you know, polarizing positions actually also have to be relaxed, but by both sides in order to, for all of us to transform together.
Yes, thank you. Let's transform the system together. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to finish now. I'm really grateful for everybody's input, and do make comments in the chat box, and I would I'm hoping that you would be interested if I run an event once or twice a month as a discussion group, and then people can present their cases of change that's actually happening. But thank you all so much for coming for the last 8 or 9 weeks. That's very kind of you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Nat.